The subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and global counterterrorism will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum. We will now proceed. I'll recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the current situation in Tunisia. In December 2010, the Arab Spring erupted in Tunisia. Mohamed Bouazizi, a young street vendor, resorted to self-immolation to protest police harassment. And within 10 days from that moment, President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, the country's long-standing authoritarian dictator, fled to Saudi Arabia. In the days and months following, democratic protest movements took hold across the Middle East and North Africa, from Egypt to Bahrain, Syria to Libya to Yemen. Unfortunately, the widespread hope for a democratic future that took root in 2011 has reverted to either continued authoritarianism or civil war in the decades since. Tunisia alone has stood as the bastion of success in the region. It was lauded for its first free election in October 2011, has maintained peaceful transitions of power and democratic rule since then. As we approach the 11th anniversary of the start of the Arab Spring, it's become apparent that Tunisia's democracy is at risk. On July 25th, President Kais Saied, a constitutional law professor elected in 2019, began asserting sweeping and troubling executive authorities by invoking a disputed reading of his constitutional emergency powers to freeze the parliament, suspend parliamentary immunity, and dismiss the prime minister and some cabinet members. On August 24th, ahead of the anticipated 30-day deadline for lifting the current state of exception, President Saied extended it indefinitely. In September, President Saied announced plans to draft a new electoral code and appoint transitional leadership, all while maintaining the exceptional powers that he seized in July. Most recently, President Saied named the Arab world's first female prime minister, Najla Bouden, and swore in a new cabinet. Yet, Tunisian parliament remains suspended, and many parliamentarians remain in detention on politicized charges, with no indication from Saied as to when or even if there is a plan to reopen parliament or free detained MPs. Despite some positive movement in recent weeks, I remain deeply concerned by President Saied's actions. It is a slippery slope when leaders take action under the assumption that they alone can fix the problems that their nation is facing. We all know here in this deliberative body that progress does not move in a straight line. Democracy, government by and for the people, is not a destination or a box to check. It's a process, a form of government that must be worked on and fought for. We fight for our own democracy every day. Tunisia, the democratic example of the post-Arab Spring world, has made incredible gains over the past 11 years. But its people and leaders must continue to fight for the representative government that they want and that they deserve. I recognize that a democratic form of government does not nullify or mitigate the legitimate continued grievances, excuse me, of the Tunisian people, including corruption, political paralysis, economic stagnation, and inadequate COVID-19 response efforts. I stand committed and ready to support the Tunisian people in both endeavors, supporting Tunisia's democratic transition and constitutional reform process, and bolstering the international response to the political and economic challenges facing the country. Both are vital to Tunisia's success. It's important to note here that there is longstanding bipartisan support for Tunisia and the U.S.-Tunisian relationship in this Congress and here on this committee. We provide substantial support to Tunisia. We all want to see a stable, prosperous Tunisia, and we want to see the Tunisian people chart their own successful future. I'm very grateful that we have with us this afternoon a distinguished panel of witnesses who are immensely qualified to help us understand the current political crisis in Tunisia, the root causes of the tension, and hopefully to offer suggestions that will protect U.S. interests while also promoting the long-term well-being of the Tunisian people. And I want to thank them for their participation today. Unfortunately, Ranking Member Wilson is unable to be with us today, but I want to note his longtime interest in and support for Tunisia. And in his absence, I am pleased to yield to my colleague, Vice Ranking Member Stubbe, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. The U.S. has helped the Tunisian people with generous development and security assistance to help grow Tunisia's institutions and improve its economy. However, we're not seeing the results of our significant U.S. tax dollar assistance today. While the U.S. has invested considerably in Tunisia in terms of foreign aid and assistance, U.S. policy never concentrated on promoting trade and free market economic development in the country, which could have actually caused Tunisians' democracy to succeed. The United States poured millions of taxpayer dollars into foreign aid in Tunisia, but without real free market reforms. Tunisia's leftist unions continued to push for deepening state control of the economy and socialism, which allowed the economy to stagnate. The Tunisian constitution does not say that the president can suspend the constitution or freeze parliament. It does not say he can fire the prime minister, but to consult with him. However, that is exactly what President Said did when he announced this summer a new cabinet that will ultimately answer to him rather than Prime Minister Abouaoun. He swept aside much of the constitution similar to a coup. Tunisia's president is not our friend. He has pushed an anti-American, anti-Israel agenda since running in his campaign and since taking office. Rather than putting forward real free market reforms, the president has essentially announced that he will double down on a socialistic agenda, and he has even threatened private businesses to lower prices or else. This does not bode well for Tunisia's future. The Tunisians' democracy and constitution, as well as U.S. tax dollars, are now being tested. President Said dismissed the prime minister and froze parliament, triggering international concern that Tunisia could backslide away from democracy. However, these moves were supported by some Tunisians. Thus, Tunisia's friends face a conundrum in trying to identify what best serves the will of the Tunisian people. The recent appointment of a new prime minister and cabinet is a good step to resolving this political crisis. However, there are still many outstanding issues that need to be addressed. I hope our witnesses today will offer some thoughts on the appropriate role that the United States and our partners can play in encouraging Tunisia to resolve these issues. I also hope our witnesses can help contextualize this discussion. I believe it is past time for us to revisit and reconsider our foreign assistance to Tunisia. What should be the goals of the U.S.-Tunisia relationship, and why the United States should be involved in helping Tunisians address the underlying challenges that created their current level of discontent with the government and the economy, especially when one can easily dismiss the Constitution and with some Tunisians supporting this move. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today to offer their insights. In particular, I'd like to welcome back Eddy Acevedo, the former longtime Middle East Subcommittee staff director who is appearing before us as a witness today. And with that, I yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. I will now introduce our distinguished witnesses. First, Dr. Elie Abouaoun is the director of the U.S. Institute of Peace, Middle East, and North Africa programs based in Tunis, Tunisia. He's previously served as the executive director of the Arab Human Rights Fund, as well as the acting country director and program manager of the Danish Refugee Council in Iraq. Dr. Abouaoun has been a visiting lecturer at St. Joseph University, Lebanon, on human rights, civil society, advocacy, and citizenship, and is a doctor of dental surgery. Next, Dr. Amna Guellali is the Deputy Regional Director for Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International. She previously served as Senior Tunisia and Algeria researcher at Human Rights Watch, where she investigated human rights abuses in both countries, as an analyst at the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of The Hague, and as a senior researcher at the Department of International Law at the Asser Institute. She has also served as legal officer at the regional delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Tunis. Dr. Guellali holds a Ph.D. from the European University Institute in Florence and was awarded Hamed's Leaders for Democracy Award in 2017. Ms. Alexis Arieff is a specialist in African affairs at the Congressional Research Service. where her analysis focuses on North, West, and Central Africa. Before joining CRS 12 years ago, she previously worked as a researcher on Africa for the Committee to Protect Journalists, as well as a research fellow in the International Crisis Group's West Africa Field Office, and as a contributing writer for Freedom House. Ms. Arieff has been detailed to policy offices at the State Department and Defense Department, and served as an international election observer in Tunisia and Guinea. She was a Fulbright Scholar in Conakry, Guinea in 2008, 2009, and holds an MA in International Relations from Yale University. And finally, it is my great honor to present Mr. Eddy Acevedo. Mr. Acevedo serves as the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the President and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, at the Wilson Center. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Acevedo served as the Senior Director of Communications and Policy at the McCain Institute for International Leadership, and in multiple senior management positions at U.S. Agency for International Development. But for those of us on this committee, most importantly, Mr. Acevedo from 2011 to 2017 served right here on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, first as the senior professional staff member overseeing the Western Hemisphere portfolio, and then as the senior foreign policy advisor and subcommittee staff director for the Subcommittee on Middle East and North Africa, this very subcommittee, for then chair and my dear friend, Chairman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. And we welcome Mr. Acevedo back to the subcommittee with open arms. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I will now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each without objection. Your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Dr. Abouaoun, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Deutsch, honorable members, and members of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the unfolding political crisis in Tunisia. I'm the director of the Middle East and North Africa programs of the USAID, based in Tunis. However, the views expressed here are not new. On July 25th, following nationwide protests in the middle of the political, social, and health crisis, the President of the Republic, Mr. Said, invoked Article 8 of the Constitution to lift parliamentary immunity, suspend the parliament for 30 days, and dismiss the Prime Minister. The decision was greeted with tribulation on the streets of the nation. However, fears of democratic backsliding were exacerbated on August 24th, when the President extended the extraordinary powers indefinitely. Finally, on September 22nd, Mr. Said replaced much of the Constitution with a 3-page decree that officially restored the Parliament and granted himself control over all executive and legislative of the country, while renewing his pledge to bring about rule of law and impunity and restore the proper functioning of the state. A potentially positive development was the appointment days ago of the Prime Minister and new government. It remains to be seen how much influence this new government will have on the government. Prior to July 25th, Tunisia was not a consolidated democracy. The 2011 revolution resulted in more personal freedoms and political pluralism, but these elements alone did not constitute a consolidated democracy and did not necessarily portend economic prosperity. And while far less frequent than pre-2011, the government's use of security sector and the judiciary to suppress dissent continued post-revolution. After his September decision, the President has brought the support of the major civil society organizations, private sector, and nearly all of the political parties, including largest elected party in the parliament of Amna and Islamist party distinct from the Muslim Brotherhood. In line with their president, there is a consensus among Tunisians that the expectations of the 2011 revolution have not been met yet. However, there is a disagreement about what kind of intervention is necessary to put the country on a path of prosperity and democracy. The president's focus on remaking the political system overlooks the need for more structural, economic, and social reform. In addition, the public perception that the Tunisian state has unlimited resources creates unrealistic expectation that no political system can accommodate. A more reliable course of action for Tunisia to achieve political stability will be to focus on economic growth and to lay out a comprehensive and inclusive political roadmap emphasizing the return to normal institutional governance, including a democratically elected parliament that delivers justice and accountability for what happened since 2011. In the last 10 years, the US has made several strategic investments in Tunisia, especially in the areas of security, justice, military assistance, financial support, economic growth, democratic governance, and civil society strengthening. While using its points of leverage carefully to decelerate political slide toward autocracy, the U.S. must continue to proactively support political stability and the promotion of pluralistic and democratic movement. In the current context, abandoning the engagement of security forces will not be in the interest of the United States or Congress. Indicators of when security assistance should be considered include the deterioration of human rights, continued absence of a plan to restore democratic order, or other indications that Tunisia's old regime could be state is being restored. One of the largest successes from U.S. investment in Tunisia since 2011 is the flourishing and professional civil society. Now more than ever, the civil society and key public institutions need America's steady strategic support and protection. Unlike other countries in the region where similar power gaps did not with the same level of concern, it is promising that many Tunisians have realized that President Said's decisions since July 25th are dangerous for the country. Furthermore, despite the polarization and tension in Tunisia, there has not been an outbreak of unrest, nor has the government resorted tactics of large-scale violence and intimidation, which is encouraging. Lastly, beyond some diplomatic media discourse, there has not been any action taken by Tunisia to downsize the partnership with the United States. The most constructive way to influence the course of events in Tunisia is through concerted multilateral pressure, international and regional, through quiet diplomacy. The democratic and friendly Tunisia is in the national security interest of the United States. Pressure on the president must be targeted, firm, quiet, and multilateral. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Abouaoun. Next, we will go to Dr. Guellali. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry, it took me some time to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Chairman Dutch and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Amnesty International, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to submit this testimony and for convening this important hearing on the current circumstances in Tunisia, a country where I am residing right now, and I'm also Tunisian. Since President Kais Saied claimed exceptional powers on July 25th, Tunisia has been undergoing troubling political turmoil. However, one must not forget that the country's system of governance was increasingly dysfunctional long before then. For a significant number of Tunisians, the daily spectacle of a parliament that was at best paralyzed and at worst the scene of violence and insults had become insufferable, and many considered that President Said's move to suspend parliament was a legitimate attempt to give a new impetus to the country's political transition. In issuing Decree 117 on September 22nd, President Said has taken an even more radical turn, suspending most of the constitution and formally granting himself nearly unfettered powers to legislate and govern. He has barred people from challenging his decrees and decisions. This absence of any supervisory powers, including any authority to review the president's decision, is an outright weakening of human rights protections in the country. Amnesty International has documented several violations of human rights since the announcement of these exceptional powers. In the name of fighting corruption and ensuring security, authorities imposed arbitrary travel bans against at least 50 Tunisians. They have also placed at least 12 others under abusive house arrests, including high-profile figures such as the former president of a state body to fight corruption. One particularly worrying incident concerns Slimane Bouhafs, an Algerian activist and UN-recognized refugee in Tunisia, who was forcibly abducted by unknown men from his home in Tunis in August and forcibly returned to Algeria, where he is now imprisoned and faces persecution. President Said has so far said nothing publicly about the incident, and authorities have not announced any formal investigation into it. However, while discussing these violations, we must also remember that Tunisia was not a paradise for human rights prior to July 25th. Arbitrary travel bans and house arrests, violations of freedom of speech, and trials of civilians before military courts were already common under previous governments. Regarding freedom of peaceful assembly, Tunisian security forces have responded unevenly to demonstrations since July 25th. During recent protests against Ayed, security forces refrained from carrying out dispersal or responding with force. This contrasts with the way security forces have conducted themselves during the socio-economic protests that swept the country in 2021, when they arrested more than 2,000 protesters and allegedly mistreated some of them. As a conclusion, I would say that Tunisia suffered serious human rights violations both before and after July 25th. Despite recent positive steps, such as the lifting of some arbitrary house arrests, the long-term outlook is still troubling. Nearly all powers remain concentrated in the hands of President Said, and meanwhile, the economic crisis could swiftly transform into a political one as ordinary Tunisians grow increasingly desperate, leading people to take to the streets and raising the chances of violent crackdowns by the authorities. So in this situation, we hope that the United States will continue to support Tunisia's path towards the respect of human rights during this period of upheaval. And I would like to make the following recommendations to the Congress and to US authorities in general: to urgently and publicly call on Tunisian authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all those who are detained solely for expressing their human rights, to halt investigations and prosecutions of civilians before the military justice system, and to lift all arbitrary travel bans and house arrests, to also push for to urge the president to rein in security forces who have long carried out abuses with impunity against Tunisians and might be emboldened by the state of emergency, and hold accountable all those reasonably suspected of committing crimes under international law, to push for the immediate opening of a thorough, impartial, and transparent investigation into the forced abduction and unlawful transfer to Algeria of a UN refugee, and make the results of the investigation public. And finally, to support and amplify the call by civil society organizations and activists on the ground for the government to commit to a reform agenda on all levels. So thank you again for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to answering the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guellali. Ms. Arieff, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Congressman Stubbe, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the Congressional Research Service to testify today. President Kais Saied's assertion of sweeping executive powers has fueled uncertainty about the future of Tunisia's young democracy, which successive US administrations and Congress have sought to foster, as you know. Reactions within Tunisia have varied. Many Tunisians share the view that their political system and leaders have failed to deliver on the promise of the country's 2011 uprising. Economic hardships were severe, even prior to the depredations of COVID-19, while political disputes have impeded institutional reforms and anti-corruption efforts. The extent of agreement on what should replace the status quo is less certain, however. Opposition to President Saied's approach may have grown in recent weeks, with some previously ambivalent political parties and Tunisia's powerful trade union federation voicing acute concerns about his intention to govern by decree and amend the constitution and electoral law. Yet President Saied appears at present to enjoy greater popular support than many of his chief antagonists, and he faces few evident institutional constraints. His opponents are internally divided and mutually distrustful. In recent weeks, thousands of Tunisians have turned to the streets in rival protests for and against the president, and public opinion is likely to continue to evolve. The potential for broad coalition building, or conversely, escalating confrontation, is in question. Even with his apparent control of the state security apparatus, President Saied's power and claim to legitimacy arguably rest on his assertion of popular backing. It remains to be seen whether the president can deliver on his pledge to improve people's daily lives and how he might respond if more of the public turns against his leadership. The president has not articulated a clear roadmap for political reforms or an economic plan amid stalled negotiations with the IMF over a new lending package. Among the issues that Congress may consider is whether recent developments undermine or strengthen the case for US aid and engagement, and whether a shift in scope or emphasis is warranted. Recent developments played out after the House Appropriations Committee reported its FY 2022 aid appropriations measure, which would provide at least $197 million in economic and security assistance for Tunisia. This is equivalent to the Biden administration's budget proposal earlier this year, and would continue a practice in which Congress has annually provided a minimum floor of aid for Tunisia, with the practical effect of ensuring funds amid competing global priorities. The Defense Department has provided additional security cooperation in recent years, and the US Millennium Challenge Corporation has approved, but not yet signed, a 5-year, nearly $500 million development aid compact to strengthen Tunisia's transportation, trade, and water sectors. The extent to which US aid and security cooperation present opportunities for leverage is debatable. President Said has shown little evidence of being open to external pressure or incentives. He campaigned as an anti-system candidate, won in a landslide, does not have a political party, and appears to rely on a small circle of advisors. He has castigated domestic critics as corrupt and treacherous. Moreover, US aid seeks to advance US stated policy goals, such as supporting civil society, local entrepreneurship, COVID-19 response, law enforcement capacity, and Tunisia's ability to provide for its own security. Encouragement of Tunisia's democracy has been one, but not the only, stated aim of US engagement over the past decade. Nor is the United States the sole or necessarily most influential external actor. Tunisians, for their part, have engaged in much debate over the desirability of external pressure at this juncture. US aid and diplomatic messaging may nonetheless be viewed as an expression of US ideals and priorities. In the case of some countries, Congress has imposed legislative restrictions or conditions on certain types of US assistance, often simultaneously granting the executive branch flexibility to waive or bypass them on humanitarian, national security, or other grounds. Congressional oversight represents an additional potential tool. Looking ahead, over the past decade, Tunisians have repeatedly defied observers' expectations by navigating a peaceful way out of political crises. Yet these crisis resolutions involved elite bargaining that arguably excluded the concerns of many ordinary people. Consensus on effective economic reforms and accountability has been much more elusive, presaging the desperation and frustrations that many Tunisians have voiced. Whether Tunisia can again deliver a course correction while also addressing deep-seated economic and institutional challenges, and what actions from the international community are most likely to help support such an outcome is a pressing question today. This concludes my testimony. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Aviva. I was unable to unmute myself. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Arieff. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for the thoughtful and thorough presentation, what we've come to expect from CRS, and we're always grateful for all that you provide to help us do our jobs better. Thank you very much. And finally, our last witness, let me find, and there he is. It is really a pleasure to welcome back as a witness to the committee that he served so well for so many years, Eddy Acevedo. Welcome back, Eddy. It's really great to have you. Sorry to call you that, but that's the way we feel about you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Deutsch, Congressman Stubbe, and members of the subcommittee, I feel like I am returning home. I spent nearly a decade working in this body in the People's House as a former staffer, and the majority of that time I had the honor of serving on this committee under Chairman Ileana Ross-Lehtinen. So thank you for convening this timely and important hearing and inviting me to testify. I behind the scenes that goes on to prepare for these hearings, So I want to especially thank Gabriela Zach and Casey Custon, or as Elie used to call her, Deutschet, for all of their hard work and their friendship. Over 6 years ago, Mr. Chairman, this same subcommittee convened a hearing entitled Tunisia's Fragile Democratic Transition, where we collectively praised Tunisia for adopting a constitution, electing a new parliament, holding elections, and even transferring power peacefully from one government to another. Now, however, Tunisia is on a slippery slope as we witness some democratic backsliding. Recent actions by President Zayed call into question if Tunisia is still heading down a democratic path. We have seen this playbook before. A recent example is in Haiti, where presidents have ended up ruling by decrees filled with empty promises and undemocratic norms, allowing the Haitian parliament to become non-functional and failing to hold timely elections. In Tunisia, it's true that people feel let down by the democratic transition, expected their newfound freedoms to be tied to economic prosperity. Instead, Tunisians are witnessing high unemployment, a struggling economy, and find it difficult to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So ultimately, why does Tunisia matter? One, we are friends with the people of Tunisia who are yearning for a free, democratic, and prosperous future, which does not occur often in the Middle East. Two, a stable Tunisia is important to regional security, migration, and it counters ambitions of potential malign actors. Russia already has a port in Syria. Another access point through Tunisia can threaten the stability of the Mediterranean. Tunisia has welcomed Huawei and wants stronger economic ties with China, even though its largest trading partner is the European Union. Further instability and chaos in Tunisia may lead to a migration crisis in North Africa and throughout Europe. Three, from a counterterrorism standpoint, we cannot forget Tunisia in the broader scheme of the fallout from the Afghanistan withdrawal if ISIS or its next iteration reemerges. Tunisia previously had the highest numbers per capita of ISIS foreign fighters heading to Syria or Iraq to fight for the caliphate. In addition, ISIS previously used training camps in Libya to carry out several attacks in Tunisia, and we also witnessed recently some suicide bombings throughout the country as well. So a less secure environment only makes it more difficult for the development professionals to operate. During my time at USAID, Tunisia was a top priority. Former Administrator Ambassador Mark Green elevated our presence in Tunisia to a full USAID mission. In 2020, Ambassador Green then traveled to Tunisia to help reaffirm how important it was not only for the agency, but to the furthering of overall U.S. interests in the region. This committee often faces many challenges in foreign policy, and sometimes even questions what leverage we have to demonstrate our values and our principles, especially when they come to democracy and human rights. But in Tunisia, we do have leverage. We can apply a carrot and stick approach to incentivize good behavior or be prepared to apply pressure in case the situation worsens. Here are just some recommendations. 1. If democratic principles continue to be undermined, spaces for civil society organizations close, and there is no path to restore democratic order in Tunisia by reinstating the parliament, then the U.S. should reassess the designation of Tunisia as a major non-NATO ally, or reevaluate our INL security programs and our foreign military financing initiatives. 2. We can re-examine any future funds for Tunisia's sovereign loan guarantee program. 3. The Millennium Challenge Corporation has seemingly paused discussion of the nearly $500 million compact. Recent actions jeopardize Tunisia's eligibility according to the MCC indicators and scorecard. 4. Tunisia is seeking a $4 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. We should use our voice, vote, and influence to seek restoration of democratic and constitutional order. 5. Our democracy networks need resources to bolster political parties, human rights defenders, independent media, and journalists. USAID, through the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening, also known as the CEPS mechanism, State Department's own Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau, and the National Endowment for Democracy should all be allocating additional resources to respond to the current crisis. USAID can also dispatch its Office of Transition Initiatives to assess the current environment and needs that can be addressed by the agency's Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Bureau. In short, Mr. Chairman, we cannot wait to act any longer to determine whether or not President Zayed is the Democrat we all hoped for. Parliament must be reinstated, and the judiciary should be independent. Stability and prosperity in Tunisia is in our national security and foreign policy interests. If the U.S. does not step in now, we'll leave the door open for our adversaries to potentially fill the void. Tunisians have proven that they have what it takes to turn this around, but we must lend a helping hand before the crisis becomes untenable. We can no longer have a wait-and-see attitude. We want Tunisia to succeed, and we need it to succeed, but we must act now before it's too late. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acevedo, for your outstanding testimony today. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here and for sharing your important insight. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will defer until the end of questioning, so we'll start by recognizing Mr. Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, and thank you to our ranking member for holding today's really important hearing. And this hearing is a reminder, really, of the continuing obligation that we have to help support emerging democracies around the world. And as the chairman said, this is an evolving and continuous responsibility, even in our own country. So thank you to all the witnesses for your extraordinary testimony. I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Abouaoun. I hope I pronounced that correctly. A recent report from Freedom House shows democracy has now been on the decline around the world for more than 15 years, and what has been described as a democratic recession. And as we continue to see increased fragility in democratic institutions around the world, particularly what we're seeing in Tunisia, what can we learn from our foreign policy approach in Tunisia that might enhance our ability to support democracies around the world? Are there lessons that we should learn from this experience? That's for Dr. Abouaoun.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that the U.S. spent a lot of money on supporting democratic transitions and implementation all over the world. If I take a few lessons learned from the region, in which I have expertise, I think that one of the lessons learned is that this funding should aim for longer-term transformative intervention. In most of the cases, the money was spent on mostly transactional interventions, and the democratic recession that you rightly pointed to is partly caused by the fact that the democratic values are not fully embedded at the grassroots level. And for this to happen, we need to work on transformative interventions that require a longer-term approach than the ones that we have taken.
Thank you. Dr. Guellali, one of the primary causes, at least that has been reported, of the public discontent within Tunisia leading up to President Zayed's announcement was the conduct of the police and the brutality. And I know you've spoken out a lot about that. Could you speak a little bit in the hearing today about the history of police violence? Does it raise concerns currently? What steps are the government taking to curtail it? And are there things that we should be doing as a Congress of the United States to support those efforts?
Thank you, thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. I think that the history of police violence in Tunisia was really very important because they played a central role, a pivotal role in during the years of dictatorship. And while there were some efforts to reform the security services after the fall of the Ben Ali regime, security services still act in a very abusive way. And this has culminated really during the socio-economic protests that swept the country in 2021, when the security forces really acted in a very brutal way to quell those protests and to hold them. So I think what is really needed right now in Tunisia is for the security services to act in an accountable way. I think fostering the transitional justice process that has been in place in the country for the past 5 years or so is really important. Calling on the Tunisian authorities to hold accountable those who are in those of the security forces who have committed crimes is really important. And I would like to bring your attention to the fact that President Said, after the 25th of July, has appointed several security forces members to the high state security apparatus who are accused of perpetrating crimes against the people of Tunisia during the dictatorship. They have current trials before the transitional justice chambers, and they should be held accountable and
Absolutely.
not appointed.
I just wanted to get one last question before I run out of time. We saw firsthand in Afghanistan how corruption really can erode public confidence in government and ultimately jeopardize long-term stability. Do any of the witnesses have ideas of what we can do to make sure that the funding we're providing is being used responsibly, and that we can provide some kind of better oversight, because I think that remains a grave concern to many members of Congress. Anyone who might have a thought?
I believe that in terms of what are the mechanisms that the Congress should enforce in order to have a better system of accountability, including on corruption, I think supporting civil society is really important, because civil society plays right now the role of checks and balances on the work and decisions of the president. The president has barred Tunisian citizens from challenging his decisions by calling out any form of challenge, including through the judiciary. And so the fact that civil society is still able to play its role and hold him to account and play the role of checks and balances, I think it's really very important. And I believe that direct support for civil society can make a difference here.
Thank you so much. My time is good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the accommodation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I will now yield 5 minutes to the vice ranking member, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. Acevedo. Eddie, how can we best compete with Russia and China and Tunisia? And what are our best messaging points regarding the benefits of a relationship with the United States relative to others?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a great question. I mean, I think for us, we need more engagement. Right now, the department has done a very good job in expressing concern over some of the actions occurring in Tunisia. But at the same time, the U.S. government hasn't really illustrated what are we asking from the Tunisian president, and what are some of the democratic reforms that we would like, such as the reinstatement of the Tunisian parliament. I think the Russia-China aspect is one of the things that I am extremely concerned about, because we have seen in other parts of the world that they will quickly swoop in if they see that the U.S. is kind of late to the game in jumping in. We've seen some of the recent actions in terms of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has traveled to Tunisia many times over the last few years. Huawei was just in the country as well, and they kind of got a big red carpet welcome by this president. So our engagement, it is what's needed, and us being able to articulate exactly what are the democratic reforms that we would like to see to ensure that stability in the country.
And what is that kind of leads me to my next question. What is the appropriate role of the United States as an outside party in the Tunisian political crisis?
So I can tell you, Congressman, from my personal experience, when I was at USAID, USAID had some really good programs in the country. We were working to decentralize the government as much as possible and push matters into the local level so that we can have a better representation from the people. We were able to work with the youth to try to prevent some radicalization that's happened in the past. We were also able to support religious tolerance and religious liberties in the country. But I admit, Congressman, that we've done good work, but we need new ideas. And I think that's where my recommendation regarding the initiatives at USAID, they are really the tip of the spear for us in terms of foreign policy at USAID, and their kind of reassessment on the new challenges in Tunisia would be helpful. You know, this office is kind of one of the best known secrets in our foreign policy apparatus. Right now, it's only appropriated about $92 million from Congress. It really needs more funds than that because they are very spread thin, and the more we can support these good professionals, the better it is for us in our foreign policy.
So how are our European partners viewing the recent political developments in Tunisia?
So right now, the European Union is extremely concerned. Trade between the EU and Tunisia, Tunisian trade to the EU accounts for about 80 to 85% of their trade. So the EU is their biggest market, number one. Number two, the Europeans are worried not only from the economic standpoint, but obviously from the migration standpoint. We've seen a lot of kind of waves of migrants hitting the seas and trying to head north. But there's also a NATO component here, right? And ultimately, you know, if China and Russia set up a foothold in Tunisia, that could be destabilizing for our NATO partners in the region as well.
And what are the practical implications of the president disbanding the parliament?
Well, so Congressman, this really comes down to legitimacy. You know, he formed a new government just days ago. Many of the ministers that swore an oath, they swore an oath to a constitution that he suspended. So one begins to question any decisions that these ministers make. Is it legitimate or not? The MCC compact, for example, needs to be ratified by the Tunisian parliament. Obviously, that cannot happen if the parliament is disbanded. So I think for us, we have to look at the legitimacy as one of the biggest impacts. Typically, when the prime minister forms the government, there is a little bit of a vote, so to speak, in the parliament. And that's part of their constitution. Obviously, that did not happen because everything has been suspended. So all of these issues are extremely troubling, and hopefully we can nudge a little bit so that the right decisions are made, and that the president shows an inclusive process on how to get out of this current crisis.
My time's expired. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. I will now go to Ms. Manning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for organizing this very important hearing on the deeply concerning situation in Tunisia. And thank you to all our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Acevedo, you've done a great job of laying out your recommendations that the U.S. use a carrot and stick approach to influence the future behavior of Tunisia. Can you talk to us about where has this sort of approach worked successfully? And what kinds of incentives do you think would most likely encourage the president to change the way he's behaving?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. So, you know, I'll be honest, sometimes the carrot and stick approach works and sometimes it doesn't, right? But I think ultimately, you know, it's always good to give it the good old college try. And for us, you know, being able to articulate kind of what our role needs to be in this process, I think is helpful. President Said on the economic side, I think is something that we hold a lot of leverage. The part of the current crisis in Tunisia and a lot of the unrest that's happening in the country is because of the high unemployment and their economy is struggling. Through a lot of our efforts and our programs that we have in the country, whether it's the IMF program that needs to be redone, some of the economic reforms that need to happen, as well as one of something that doesn't get much attention is Congress in 2013 passed legislation and appropriated something called the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund. And this is an entity that has been pretty successful in Tunisia to help small and medium-sized businesses. And right now, it's sort of the largest supporter of small and medium-sized businesses in the country. So I think our leverage on the economic side is vital, and also on the security side. You know, we have a lot of leverage there as well through many of the DoD and State Department programs.
Thank you. Ms. Arieff, since 2011, the United States has steered, as we just were talking about, significant financial assistance to Tunisia to help promote stability and improve prosperity. Can you tell us which U.S. aid efforts have been the most effective?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you note, there has been significant U.S. foreign assistance resources directed toward Tunisia in the last decade, including by bipartisan support in Congress for these provisions in annual foreign aid appropriations measures that have provided in just the past few years, for example, $85 million annually in foreign military financing, $85 million annually in economic support fund and development assistance, again, annually, as well as around $13 million to $15 million annually in additional internal security assistance for Tunisia's police and security apparatus. That economic assistance, as Mr. Acevedo has outlined, has supported a range of initiatives, including economic aid, entrepreneurship support, policy reforms, as well as democracy and governance. I think that, sorry, I was going to say the success is obviously mixed.
That's what I was hoping for. Is there some investment that has worked that we want to continue or double down on?
It's a judgment call in many cases, but I would say that there's some evidence of effectiveness for some programs, including both on the economic and security side.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Guellali, do you see any reason for hope with the appointment of the first female prime minister, or was this solely aimed at placating critics? And can you also talk about the status of women's rights in Tunisia?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Manning. When it comes to the new government, on paper, I think that this government has a great potential. It is, as you know, led by a woman, Mrs. Najla Boudin, and is composed of 26 highly qualified ministers, including 9 women. Unfortunately, the new prime minister does not have a lot of powers, unlike its predecessors, who used to have even more powers than the president. The reason is that in Decree 117 that the president enacted on the 22nd of September, he declared this decree declared that the president exercises all the executive powers, and he is assisted by a government. So the president may, for example, unilaterally dismiss any minister. He is the only one responsible for designating state policies and has the powers to create or dissolve institutions. And in this framework, the head of government under this system has only a secondary role and will be dependent on the president's will and whims. And so in this situation, while it's really great that Tunisia has a new government, I believe that this was one of the demands and expectations from the various from the various observers and analysts, including from Tunisian people, but at the same time, it remains to be seen whether they will have all the powers that they need in order to enact those reforms leading to a new system of governance, which is one of the promises from President Said.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Manning. Representative Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, I thank the chairman and the ranking member for the opportunity. I thank the witnesses. My first question is going to Ms. Arieff, so if you want to unmute now. First, thanks for providing your input, your CSR background, or CRS background prior to the hearing. Given that the United States has provided hundreds of millions of dollars over the years for the purpose of augmenting Tunisia's counterterrorism capabilities, their total investment in that goal is of reasonable, if not paramount importance to the United States of America. Now, in 2016, news outlets, including the Jerusalem Post, reported that the Mossad had eliminated a Hamas operative, Mohammed Zawahiri, working with within Tunisia. My objection here is not to figure out or to talk about or discuss who did what when, but rather pose the question to determine the motivation of the government in Tunis to prevent or otherwise marginalize the influence of Hamas, specifically and especially within its borders. When he won the 2019 Tunisian election, President Said draped himself in a Palestinian flag, and he has frequently expressed anti-Semitic sentiment, particularly as he has tried to shield himself from his own shortcomings and those of his own domestic policies. Now, to quote him, and I quote, "We know very well who the people are who are controlling the country today. It is the Jews who are doing the stealing, and we need to put an end to it," unquote. Now, for years, the United States and Tunisia have maintained a robust counterterrorism relationship. And in fact, Tunisia is the largest beneficiary of states' trans-Saharan counterterrorism partnership. However, in speaking specifically about Hamas, I would like to ask you if it's your assessment that the United States can trust the Tunisian president and his government enough to prevent Hamas from growing in influence within Tunisia, or is the 2016 instance an aberration, so to speak?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm afraid I don't have much insight into the incident that you mentioned beyond what was reported in the press. That I would say that I would note that 2016 was before President Said was inaugurated, so it was under the previous government. The only other thing I would add is that U.S. counterterrorism assistance for Tunisia is primarily focused on countering U.S. designated foreign terrorist organizations that are active in Tunisia and Libya, as well as parts of Algeria. So local Islamic State affiliates, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and its various offshoots. And what we've seen in the last 5 years is an improvement in Tunisia's internal security coordination and a decrease in the pace and scale of terrorist attacks within Tunisia.
And you think, so you can't really speak to, I mean, and let me phrase it another way. Based on at least the last part of what you just said, you think that with President Said, that is continuing at the current pace that it was prior to his ascension to the presidency?
I think that's a good question for the executive branch in some ways, whether military and counterterrorism cooperation have continued apace or whether there are new challenges under President Said. What I can observe publicly in terms of public statements from US AFRICOM and others is a fair amount of satisfaction with ongoing military cooperation.
And listen, I appreciate it, and I know that this is a hard question to answer. It's like asking how long is a string or something like that. But you know, just based on what happened in Afghanistan and the information coming out that for many years we knew where the Al-Qaeda was headquartered in Quetta and things like that. After seeing trillions of dollars, tax dollars, go into a place like that, I think it's just important that we have to ask these questions. So I appreciate your answer, but I just have to keep asking this stuff. Dr. Abouaoun, in late 2017, a pro-Hamas leader in Tunisia's Islamist Ennahda party met with the United States Institute of Peace. And when the investigative project on terrorism organizations asked about why a federal funded U.S. institution would willingly meet with individuals who embrace such toxic concept as terrorism, which calls for the destruction of Israel, by the way, and expressing overwhelming anti-American sentiment, USIP responded by saying that it's important to, and I quote, engage and maintain relationship with a variety of actors such as political parties, government officials, religious officials, and civil society groups to ensure inclusivity. Now, unquote. So I guess my overarching question is does the USIP feel that by engaging in these meetings, that they give individuals or organizations that espouse openly terrorism a platform that they should not otherwise have? And then as a follow-on question, what other terrorist organizations or individuals has the USIP met with?
Thank you very much. If I raised my hand before because I wanted to comment on the previous question, if you allow me. I can
feel free.
Yeah, I can say with confidence
yeah, please, if you could, we're past 5 minutes, so you can go ahead and answer, and if you could just be respectful of our time, I appreciate it.
Thanks for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you. So very briefly, I can say with confidence that there is a steady and consistent will within all branches of the Tunisian government to prevent to continue engaging with counterterrorism efforts. So this has not changed, and I don't think it's the president alone who can change this. There is a different dynamic that goes when it comes to this kind of publicity. Back to your second question, I stick to the answer provided by the Institute. Because of the nature of our work, we have to engage with different actors. The purpose of our engagement with these actors is not to endorse their political positions. There is a very specific purpose that has to do with our work on the ground. If you want to be a facilitator and to convene dialogue and to prevent violence on the ground, there are a specific set of actors we have to work with. Whether you like them or not is another story, whether you endorse their political position is another story. But I can assure you that in all cases, we make sure that we don't give agency to actors who act against the interests of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Representative Perry. Representative Malinowski, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Deutsch. Let me start by defending USIP more explicitly than USIP just did. The individual in the political party that USIP met with, Ennahda, not only does not support terrorism, it is one of the strongest opponents of terrorism and extremism in the Tunisian political sphere. Mr. Ghannouchi has met with senior U.S. government officials through multiple administrations and has been seen by Republican and Democratic administrations as a very positive force in that country. So let me just categorically reject what Mr. Perry suggested. There's nothing inappropriate about that meeting. We should all be meeting with in Tunisia's democratically elected political parties. Look, I've been a very strong supporter of U.S. assistance to Tunisia. I think we should have done a lot more over the last 10 years. I traveled there multiple times when I was in the State Department. Let's face it, the reason why we have tried to pay attention to Tunisia, in part, it's been an important partner in counterterrorism, but largely it's because this small country has played an outsized role in the drama that has engulfed the Middle East since the Arab Spring. It is the only survivor of the Arab Spring, or it was, until the recent coup against democracy. So it is important in the larger debate in the region between democracy and authoritarianism. And my first question goes to whether Tunisia has been important in that context, not just to us, but to others who may be on the other side of that struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. And I'm thinking particularly about some of the Gulf countries that supported the coup in Egypt as well, that supported the anti-democratic Haftar movement in Libya, that see a Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy everywhere, that citizens in the Arab world push for more open and democratic systems of government, and that are threatened by the rise of democracy. And I wonder, perhaps Ms. Arieff, if you can address that question. There was a lot of rhetorical support for the coup in Tunisia from a lot of voices in the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular. I wonder if you can comment on whether there's any evidence that that support has gone beyond just rhetoric.
Thank you, Congressman. It is true that some of the strongest rhetorical support that we've seen from government officials for President Said's actions has come from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, to a slightly lesser extent, Algeria. So that rhetorical support does suggest an interest in what is happening in Tunisia, and perhaps a different view of President Said's actions than what has been expressed by the Biden administration and many members of Congress.
And why are they so interested in this? What's their motivation?
You know, a range of motivations, no doubt, but I think clearly there is less concern for an erosion of formal democratic norms or checks and balances internally. There is an interest in stability and perhaps a perception that President Said is well placed to deliver that. I would say you referred to resources. One thing that we might look to in the coming weeks and months, we've touched on Tunisia's economic and fiscal challenges, is whether we will see new pledges of direct financial support for Tunisia through bilateral assistance, for example, or grants or loans coming from some of these countries. And that would give perhaps a stronger indication of the level of stakes that these countries perceive in the outcome.
Okay. And then let me ask maybe you, Ms. Guellali, what should the United States do? What is to be done is the ultimate question here. I mean, there is, I think, a broad consensus within the Biden administration that this was a coup. They may not use that language. I think there's a debate about the best way for the United States to use its leverage with respect to military aid, security assistance to the police and the military especially. The president's actions were popular, at least initially in Tunisia, and that is a factor also weighing on the administration. What is your advice? What is the bottom line in terms of the primary leverage that the United States has to effect a return to parliamentary democracy?
Thank you very much, Congressman Malinowski. I would say that I can advise on what not to do rather than what to do, basically, because that is really a very difficult question to answer to in terms of policy. But I believe that one thing that the US should not do is cutting military and security aid to Tunisia to pressure the return to the democratic process. And I believe that this would be a misguided decision, as it will have really very bad repercussions on the security of the country and might lead also to the deterioration of the security environment, not only in Tunisia, but also in the entire region. It will be also inconsistent with US policy in Tunisia for the past years. I believe I mentioned during the testimony that security forces have committed numerous and grave human rights violations during the transition. And most recently, under the Mishishi government, they arrested thousands of people and mistreated, allegedly, hundreds of them. So cutting military aid or conditioning it right now to the return to the democratic process, while the US remained silent in the face of such human rights violations in the past, would be really inconsistent, I believe. I think the US should mainly use its leverage on Tunisian security and armed forces to impose respect for human rights on all levels, including during the policing of demonstrations and fostering accountability. I think also that what is really needed right now in Tunisia is to have and impose checks and balances on the actions of the president, especially that so far he has shielded himself from any kind of challenges to his decisions. And that is something that could be done through the pushing of a reform agenda, but also working with civil society in Tunisia. I think amplifying the voices of civil society is really important, because it is difficult, I believe, in this environment where the president enjoys such a broad popularity for the US to cut ties with Tunisia, because it would be considered really as cutting ties also with the Tunisian people. And I think this is not the right moment to do that.
Congressman, can I add something real quick?
Well, my time is up, so it's up to the chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Acevedo, I'm confident that you'll have an opportunity to respond to that, but we're well past time, so I'm going to keep this moving as your old boss would have done in this same situation. Thank you very much, Mr. Malinowski. And Mr. Mast, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Mr. Deutsch, I'll let Mr. Acevedo respond right now. That's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mass. As a native Floridian, I appreciate that. Just real two quick things. One, to the congressman, I think if the administration can send unequivocal messages that we would like the parliament to be reinstated, would be a very important message. I think that while it is true, obviously, that the Tunisian parliament is not popular, it doesn't mean you can just suspend it just because they're not popular. And I think sending that message, I think, is important. Secondly, I would say we should be doubling down on our civil society programs. I think all of our democracy networks, whether it's at USAID, the NET, or DRL, could be out there and allocating additional resources to help civil society right now during their time of need.
I think your response to the previous question, it actually plays right into one of the things that I wanted to speak about. And let's be clear about Tunisia. It was the start. It was the starting point for the Arab Spring. Really, I mean, it just symbolically very important. But there was a great Bloomberg article that I read a few weeks back on this, and I went back and looked up the quote for it because I think it does sum up the administration's response to this very well. And I'm going to quote this article. It says, "Yet all the Biden administration managed was a neutral sounding message from the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, encouraging Said to adhere to the principles of democracy," very neutral, and still weak, if slightly better message from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who called on Said to form a new government and ensure the timely return of the elected parliament. The coded language of diplomacy, these messages basically told Said to go ahead and do whatever he wanted. That was how the article surmised the response of the administration to what had gone on there. You just called for Mr. Acevedo, a strong response. We didn't see a strong response. That's the fact. We saw a very weak response, which is not surprising, in the midst of everything that was going on with Afghanistan and the weakness that we saw being portrayed there. But I want to ask a slightly different question. And that's in terms of something that you talked about, and that was the fighters from Tunisia in Afghanistan over the course of the time that we've been fighting in Afghanistan. Do you have an idea personally of the path, whether a land path or through ports of entry from the air, on how Tunisians were getting into Afghanistan? Was it a land path, going through Egypt and Jordan and Iran? Was it a path flying into Pakistan, flying into Iran, flying into other places? What was the path that fighters were making their way to Afghanistan?
Congressman, to my knowledge, I think the majority of the path was through land, but perhaps my colleague from CRS may have more information on that.
Yeah, I'd yield there.
I would have to get back to you, sir. And it's possible that the intelligence community could provide a more definitive answer on that question.
No question about that. The intelligence community can, but certainly would look forward to you all getting back with a response as well on the most prominent paths for those fighters to make their way to the battlefield. I think that's something that is important for all of us to know as we look at future relationships with any of those nations that would allow fighters to move through their territories, as well as what's going on in Tunisia and those, whether in a dissolved parliament or the president, now dictator, and what actions they were doing to allow fighters to move throughout those timeframes. In that, I have no further comments or questions, Mr. Chairman, and I yield my time back.
Thank you, Representative Mast. Representative Keating, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a few years since I've been in Tunisia. I was there after one of the suicide bombings that occurred. In our discussions with officials then, the primary concern they had was the economy, unemployment, particularly unemployment among young people. I had subsequently civilian conversations with Tunisians, and it wasn't as much as that they were radicalized to these groups. They were given economic promises and promises to take care of their family that were really the precursor. They might have become radicalized later, but that explained, I think, a lot of the large increase pro rata of Tunisians engaging and being recruited here. Now, with President Said, he's telling the world right now that he's not going to be affected by any external pressures, that he's going to make just sovereign decisions, and external economic aid or assistance really won't be determinative. However, this is, I think, the best textbook example of how we can engage with the European Union, something that I've talked about repeatedly. So what I'd like for comments from the panel would be this. I think I can't see another situation that cries out more for this. The EU is the leading trading partner with Tunisia. And if the US and the EU together can calibrate more closely and hopefully even formalize the kind of assistance they have in an effort, I think that's our best case of trying to affect the process of backsliding that we're seeing occur now. So I'd like to ask the panel in the remaining time to really comment on how our effectiveness can be multiplied by working more closely with the European Union in this respect, and on the President's comment, President Said's comment, about not being affected by external forces or influence. Any member of the panel that wants to jump in.
Thank you very much. So I think that, what you said, Senator, is in line with what I suggested in my presentation, that any pressure or engagement the president has to be multilateral. I think the effectiveness will be much higher in this case. But beyond the channel, beyond the forum of the engagement, I think that a lot of money has been spent on economic and supporting the economic financially. But the area that has been somehow overshadowed and ignored is social mobility. Think of what Tunisians are looking for, especially young Tunisians, is prosperity of social mobility, upward social mobility, obviously. And one of the reasons why the president is so popular is that he embodies he's an example of someone who climbed the ladder, the social ladder, from being a university professor to becoming the president without the support, without party, without
In the 1 minute that's left, I apologize.
Yeah. So I would emphasize multilateralism and social mobility.
Want to comment on this? No. Well, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Representative Burchett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Since the European Union is Tunisia's top donor, and since China and the Gulf states are looking to get more involved in the country, would scaling back our foreign aid even be effective in pushing President Said back to more democratic norms? Anybody can answer that.
Congressman, I think it's a little too early to tell, to be honest with you. But I think if we had these serious conversations with President Said and potentially floating out there the conditioning of some of our foreign assistance, I think it's better for us to find out today where this relationship is going with the president as opposed to waiting 6 months or a year from now.
Okay. Well, on the same, anybody else want to try that? No, okay. What's y'all's take on the new government that President Said recently approved? Anybody?
I can jump in real quick, Congressman. You know, I think the new government under this apparatus where the president is still ruling by decree and holds all the power doesn't really have the effect we would like. So while some may potentially spin this as a positive step forward, which it is, giving credibility to a government and ministers who are not abiding by the Constitution doesn't carry as much weight as it should.
Okay. Anybody else want to take a shot at that? Y'all have talkative.
I can add one point. Others have illustrated the constraints, the institutional constraints that are now placed on this new cabinet in contrast to the latitude that a head of government and cabinet enjoyed under the Constitution. In addition, the decree that President Said issued on September 22nd defining those constraints states that the cabinet is responsible for implementing the president's general policy. We still don't know, based on public statements, what the president's general policy is in many domains. So as others have noted, it's very hard to predict at this point where things are going.
All right. President Said apparently is very popular in Tunisia. I understand he might even be able to making the ranks of our own chairman, Ted Deutsch, in his own district, but maybe not as much. I'm not sure. How does this affect our strategy, I guess, to coax and or push him back on the democratic track?
Congressman, this is probably one of the most toughest questions is the one you're asking, right? Because I think I would assume the President Said will say, hey, I am doing what the people want me to do. Look at my popularity numbers. And I think for us, you know, if you're going to be a democracy and a place where rule of law is respected, but the branches of government are respected, then you have to abide by those constitutions. You know, the irony of this all is that in 2014, as a former constitutional lawyer, he helped create this constitution. And now here he is suspending it. And so far, we have not seen a path on how he's going to get out of this. So, you know, I think we can help him get out of this mess. I think we definitely want Tunisia to succeed. It is in our national security and foreign policy interests. But ultimately, just because some decisions may be popular or unpopular, it doesn't mean you could just sidestep the Constitution, in my opinion, Congressman.
Anyone else? Okay, if not, I'll yield back the remainder of the time. I would tell you, Eddie, your that W up in your up-hand corner looks sort of like a WWE from the World Wrestling Enterprise. I know Congressman Deutsch, being a semi-professional wrestler himself, would have pointed that out to you if I hadn't already. So.
Well, usually, Congressman, in Florida, we like to come off the top rope, so it's quite fitting.
I'm a bionic elbow man myself, but
the gentleman has yielded the balance of his time. You're welcome in South Florida anytime, Mr. Burchett. And I'm going to jump in before this hearing goes off the rails, some might say. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We were all inspired by Tunisia in 2011, where a simple merchant vegetable seller started an Arab Spring. We all want to see all of the elements of democracy adhered to. But we are also cautioned by the success on occasion of the Muslim Brotherhood, which believes in one person. Actually, they probably just believe in one man, one vote, one time. And it's important that as we coax Tunisia toward the full rule of law and constitutional principles, that we remember that that the Muslim Brotherhood does indeed lurk, and while they are willing to use democratic methods to take power, they are not willing to cede power. I was unable, for technical reasons, to hear one of our witnesses, Dr. Elie, so I read his testimony, and he said, in part, and those of you with the same technical issues may not have heard this, some have advocated for the removal of President Said, but that would only embolden the Ennahda party and the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as remnant forces of the old regime, which has its own dangers and implications. That may explain why the Biden administration has not labeled this as a coup, has not cut our relationship with Tunisia. It is easy to say that if there is any departure from exactly the way we'd like to run things, that we slam the table and we show how strong we are. But I think our witness from the Institute of Peace shows that strength without wisdom, while occasionally describing American policy, is not the policy that the Biden administration has pursued or should pursue. Mr. Acevedo reminds us that Tunisia has been a source of Islamic terrorists. We've talked about even how they get to Afghanistan. The UN said 5,800 were there just half a decade ago, and fighting for the Islamic State, rather, not necessarily in Afghanistan, more in Syria and Iraq. And of course, these people have mostly gone back. So as we work for all of the democracy that we'd like to see, we certainly don't want to see those forces. It's interesting that President Said is a constitutional lawyer. He has invoked Article 80. I don't know if he wrote it, which allows the president to take pretty much the measures he's taken if there's an imminent threat against the country's security and independence. Of course, that envisions a constitutional court that would oversee that process. Of course, for 7 years prior to Said and under his opponents, they failed to form the constitutional court. The article also requires that the president guarantee as soon as possible a return to normal functioning of state institutions. So, Mr. Acevedo, some of the Tunisian Americans in my district have talked to me, and they envision that they'd be a plebiscite for a new constitution. This would, in a way, be a plebiscite on President Said, but they would envision a constitution more of a modeled after that of the United States than of France, with a strong president rather than a prime minister parliament system. It's hard to say that any system of government is undemocratic if it's modeled after ours. Had I been at the Constitutional Convention, I would have proposed a parliamentary system, but then again, I would have been wearing a wig, and that would have been a benefit as well. So, Mr. Acevedo, what do you know about the possibility of a plebiscite on a constitution that reflects President Said's desire for more of a presidential system?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you hit a really good point, which is the question that I would ask, which is what is it that President Zayed and where does he want to go from here? And that is what we're missing in this equation. I think from my standpoint, you know, we need the president to articulate a plan that is inclusive, a plan that does not exclude the political parties, and we need to ensure that during the reconciliation process, he's talking to those who may support him and those who may oppose him. Right? That's part of the democratic process. And I think it's also important to know that the messages that we should be sending from the U.S. Obviously, President Zayed is an important factor, but there is a whole political class in Tunisia that goes far beyond just one individual. And I just have to reiterate how important this hearing is, because I think the more we shine a spotlight on what's going on from Tunisia, and especially the parliamentarian issue, of course, the U.S. Congress speaking about a parliamentarian issue in another country really sends a very strong message. So, you know, even after this hearing, I look forward to working with all of you to continue that pressure, because I think it is very needed to help the Tunisian people.
Democracy, yes. Brotherhood, no. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. And I now yield myself a time for questioning. I think I want to start, Dr. Abouaoun. What would the Constitution and the government look like if President Zayed implemented his longstanding beliefs?
Thank you. I guess the vision of the, I mean, he did not let it out very clearly, but in general, what is known about his vision is that he prefers a non-popular direct democracy, where there is a very strong emphasis on how much local structures have power versus how much central structures have power. And obviously, he is using his functions for the last 10 years. And the grievances of the people resulting from these functions to push for presidential regime with this combined with this direct popular.
Ms. Arieff, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree that he has said different things at different times. I would note that he was not necessarily a direct actor in the drafting of the 2014 Constitution. He was a big critic, even at that time, of the direction that things took. He has, over the many years that he's been a professor and then sort of public persona and then presidential candidate, he has talked about a vision of local councils, which would in turn select parliamentarians, so not through direct election of the legislature. And so as sort of, he describes this as kind of a power flowing upward from the ground instead of downward, you know, from a unified executive. At the same time, earlier this year, prior to his actions on July 25th, he expressed support for returning to something like the 1956 Constitution, which, you know, is Tunisia's constitution after independence, which was a strongly presidentialist system with few checks and balances. So a very different political vision. I'm curious if Amna has additional insight, but it's difficult to say.
Well, let me talk to, let me actually, I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Guellali, but I want to put something else on the table first. Tunisian General Labor Union, UGTT, which is the main trade union federation, reportedly the country's largest independent organization, has been an influential organization in Tunisian society, won a Nobel Peace Prize alongside other Tunisian civil society groups, served as a channel for ordinary Tunisians' economic grievances and mediator of political disputes. And so UGTT President Taboubi expressed qualified support for President Zayed's actions after July 25th, but the organization came out in opposition to his increased consolidation of power in September and referred to his actions as a danger to democracy. Nevertheless, President Zayed says he's acting out of the will of the Tunisian people. So, Dr. Guellali, let me go to you now. How has civil society more broadly felt about President Zayed's actions, And to what extent do you feel civil society is empowered to speak out and continue to play a role in what may come next?
Thank you very much, Chairman Dutch, for this question. I think civil society had a very diverging and varied reaction to the president's move on the 25th of July. Some, such as the powerful UGTT, the workers' union you were mentioning, considered that the move was necessary to put an end to the political paralysis, but they called on the president to initiate a negotiated and quick return to the democratic process. Other civil society groups condemned the decision to suspend the parliament and considered that the president has acted outside of his constitutional powers. However, all civic forces in Tunisia today have expressed their desire to participate in the elaboration of a roadmap for the country. They have urged the president to create an open, inclusive, and consultative dialogue with all stakeholders and with a time frame for the next steps and the next stages for this situation. And so far, the president has not responded to these demands and has even mocked calls for a roadmap. He has recently vowed to have a dialogue with the youth, especially in the forlorn regions of Tunisia, but has not so far unveiled the timeline or the forms of this dialogue. So this is really, for civil society groups, it's really very important that they can participate in this dialogue and can be part of forging the new system of governance. I believe that none of the civic groups in Tunisia has called for the reinstatement of the parliament as it was, but they are calling for a new democratic, new parliamentary democracy, basically.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And one last question, Mr. Acevedo. Tunisia was a top global source of IS foreign fighters from 2014, 2015 at the height of the group's territorial influence in Iraq and Syria. UN estimates that in 2015, over 5,800 Tunisians were fighting for ISIS across the Middle East and North Africa. Many of these actors are now returning to Tunisia with no intention of giving up the fight. How could current political instability in Tunisia impact counterterrorism operations in the country? And if you care to comment on how that might impact the rest of the region, especially Libya.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It really comes down to recruitment. On the security side, my concern with Tunisia is we have different elements in this pot that are exactly what we've seen before: a struggling economy. We have a youth bulge that cannot find jobs, so they have to find where to go to, feed themselves and feed their families. And if the people start losing hope, then it could become a hotbed for recruitment for terrorist activities. Now, because of Tunisia's history and kind of where we were in 2013, 2015 on the recruitment side, all the elements are still there, which is why I'm concerned that either the spillover effect from Libya or any potential consequence from a potential reemergence on the Afghanistan front can once again pop up in Tunisia and further destabilize the region. And we usually talk about the migration crisis kind of going north towards Europe, but let's not forget we also have a security crisis on the Sahel, on the south of Tunisia, and that could be jeopardized as well if more recruitment is happening in that region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acevedo. And I want to thank all the witnesses for an important and a robust discussion today about the situation in Tunisia. This isn't easy, obviously, but I think it's really important to recognize the United States can, and I think really must, stand firm in supporting the continued democratic transition in Tunisia, calling attention to concerning actions that President Said has taken since July and has demonstrated no intention of changing the course of action, despite vocal concern from civil society and the international community. It's also our responsibility to not disregard the continued legitimate grievances of the Tunisian people and to use our voice and our vote and our assistance to strengthen Tunisia's ability to respond to the economic stagnation and terrorism challenges that they face. We all want to see a stable, prosperous Tunisia. We want to see the Tunisia in which people chart their own successful future. And in sum, the purpose of this hearing is to talk about the importance of continuing to see Tunisia move forward in democratic fashion. This is, again, this is not easy, but all of our witnesses have offered really helpful and insightful analysis of what's happening now. We're grateful to you for your participation. I want to thank all of the members for participating today. And with that, the subcommittee hearing is now adjourned. Thanks very much, everyone.